Many years ago, Mother Teresa visited Australia, and in all of her travels around, one of the journalists asked her what her impression was of this country. And she basically said, look, I've been around the whole world. I've been to some of the poorest places in the world, but I've never seen a country more poor than Australia. And the journalist was a bit surprised. But Mother Teresa kind of explains, saying, look, other countries have physical poverty. They're hungry. But Australia is spiritually poor. And I've never seen a country more spiritually poor than this place. Now, it's a really challenging comment. I think for us, we think of this place as the lucky country. We've got everything we need. And yet what Mother Teresa was recognizing is that there's a deeper level here where as much as we're physically satisfied, spiritually we're starving. And it's an interesting thing to sort of look at the world through those eyes. In this modern time, we've almost created this amazing miracle where there's such an abundance of food being produced. If anything, wastage of food is the problem. In the Western world, there's more a problem of obesity than there is of hunger. And yet, on a spiritual level, it's almost like the more we've produced physically, the more we're starving spiritually. And it's just a kind of interesting question. Like if you could see your soul, what would it look like? If you could walk through the streets of Darwin and see people on a spiritual level, what would you be seeing? We're very familiar with these distressing images of countries when there is a famine, and you see, children who are starving. But could you imagine if you could walk through Casuarina and see people on a spiritual level and see that their souls were starving in the same way? That there was such a profound hunger within them. And the question is, I suppose, what would that do to us if we saw the world that way? How would that mobilize us as a church to actually go and do something about that spiritual famine? Our souls are craving for love. In some sense, we're kind of blind to this reality because we've got so much. There is an emptiness in our souls that we can just keep filling with more and more things. As long as you've got enough money, or if you can keep yourself busy and distracted enough, that spiritual hunger pain doesn't seem that strong. But it's always there. And it's always driving us slightly crazy. There's a story in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, where these two brothers, Jacob and Esau. Jacob's the younger brother, Esau is the older brother who has the birthright. He has the inheritance. And there's a story where Esau comes back after a long day out hunting, and he's starving, he's famished. And Jacob's cooking up this really nice lunch. And Esau's like, give me the food, okay, I'm gonna die. And Jacob basically says, okay, how about we trade? I'll give you the food if you give me your inheritance. And Esau is so driven crazy by hunger, he's like, sure, deal. He trades his inheritance for a bowl of lentils. It's crazy. And later on, he regrets it terribly. But this is something which happens every single day. And I think particularly amongst Christians, that there is this spiritual hunger in us where we're prepared to sacrifice our birthright, our heavenly inheritance, for the sake of a bowl of lentils or whatever it is. Because I think fundamentally we don't know the love of God enough that it could fill that hunger. Or maybe we don't actually believe that God's love could satisfy. And so we were prepared to turn to whatever just is in front of us. And this is the tragedy. There is nothing more tragic than to trade heaven for a cheap imitation. You know, just a moment of pleasure which is going to leave you dissatisfied. And so I think the question here is, you know, do we believe that the love of God can actually satisfy that yearning within your soul? Now, basically, this is the whole story of why Jesus came. If you read the Gospels through the perspective of hunger, they make a lot of sense. It seems to be all about food. You know, Jesus is born in the town of Bethlehem. Bethlehem means the house of bread. He's laid in a manger. A manger is a food trough. You know, so straight away he's like, I'm the food of the world. You know, as he goes through, he works miracles like we hear today. He multiplies the bread because the people are hungry. You know, in John chapter 6, he says, I'm the bread of life. You know, the whole way through, he's trying to say, I am the one who's come to satisfy that hunger in you. If only you would come to me and receive. And so I think it's not a problem on God's side, it's actually a problem on our side. You know, it's not as though God is holding back the spiritual nourishment that we need. I think it's actually that we don't know how to eat it. You know, it's almost like we've been invited to a banquet, but we've got no teeth. You know, if you could imagine giving a really beautiful, nice, juicy steak to, you know, a baby who's a few months old, it's not going to do them any good. You know, they might suck on it for a bit and then throw it away because they don't actually know how to take in the nourishment. They haven't got the ability to digest it. And there is something of that for us spiritually. You know, there's sometimes a danger that we are so spiritually immature that we actually don't know how to receive the gift that's in front of us. There's a line in the letter to the Hebrews. I don't know whether you've ever read the letter to the Hebrews. Strongly suggest that you do. But the author basically starts off saying, look, by now you should be able to be fed with solid food, but I still feel like I've got to feed you with milk instead because you're not strong enough. You haven't reached a level of spiritual maturity to actually take on the mystery. And I think that sometimes speaks to where we're at. You know, I talk to so many Catholics who really don't know how to pray. You know, I talk to people who are doing ministry in the church, and I always ask, like, tell me about your prayer life. And there's an awkward shuffling of feet and excuses and like, oh, you know, I'm busy and I try. And if we use those same excuses about physical food, people would be alarmed. You know, if you said like, oh, you know, I try to eat, you know, but I'm busy, you know, and I don't really get a lot of time, there'd be an intervention going on. But there's a point here where we're almost starving ourselves. And I think there's a cultural thing here as well where we're being so bombarded by technology and distraction and everything that it's almost like we're losing that spiritual attentiveness within us. I was reading something during the week where this author was saying that, particularly for the younger generation, it's almost like they're losing their ability to connect with the spiritual. You know, because they've just grown up in a world of hyperstimulation where silence is terrifying. And it's almost like that intrinsic part of you that is yearning for God, it's almost become dead. We've got to revive this within us. We have to relearn how to pray in a way that actually nourishes us deeply and fills that emptiness. If we go back to that image of like a baby trying to eat steak, you know, there's an image used in the early church when they talked about reading the scriptures. And they talked about how it's almost like meat that you've got to chew over. You've got to chew on it for a long time before you actually get the full richness of the nutrients. And the way the early church, the early Christians prayed was very much this idea of praying constantly. It wasn't simply like say my prayers in the morning, saying them again at the night, and then be hungry during the day. Their idea was that they would take a line of scripture and recite it endlessly as they worked. And it just became this sort of background mantra almost, just chewing over a line from the Psalms or a word from the Gospels. And wanting to just suck out every last bit of goodness from it. That's a powerful way of feeding your heart. And I'd actually really encourage you to take lines from the scriptures that speak about the love of God. Even to take like the line that we hear in the second reading. Nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. Just take that one line and recite it for the rest of today and see how you feel. Allow that word of God to drop down deeper and deeper into you until it actually meets that deep emptiness, that place where you're yearning and craving for love. Allow that truth to become the truth of your life. Even as we come here to the Mass, we receive Christ here in the Eucharist. We believe that this is the whole power of heaven. And yet how often do you walk away from the Mass feeling just as empty as when you came in? There's a point where we've got to do this differently. Like we've actually got to stop and allow it to sink in. And I really encourage you, at the end of Mass, instead of doing the dash to the car park, just sit down for 5 minutes and just meditate again on what have you received? What is the love that has come into you? Allow that love to actually meet your yearning. And I think from there, you're going to walk away feeling satisfied. So we need to learn how to eat. I think that's the problem here. Christ is giving us everything we need. But we need to trust that that food can actually satisfy. And we need to learn how to actually sit with it, allow it to go deep into us until we really are convinced that nothing can separate us from the love of Christ.